My uncle mocked me for being the disappointment, so I revealed his debt to everyone. I'm 31, my name's Ryan, and this all went down yesterday in the most regular, trashy, suburban way possible. A family birthday cookout that turned into a quiet, nuclear mess. I live about 40 minutes outside of Cleveland, in a pretty boring neighborhood of townhouses and strip malls, and my Saturdays usually look like laundry, grocery runs, and maybe a game on in the background. Yesterday was supposed to be just that, plus my mom's reminder that we're doing something small for Grandpa, don't be late. I woke up a little before 9, made coffee that tasted slightly burnt because I forgot to clean the machine, and scrolled through emails at my tiny kitchen table while the heat kicked on and that dusty, warm air smell filled the place. That's when I saw the text from my mom with the address and the time, and under it, a short, "Please be nice to your uncle, okay?" which already told me the vibe for the day. The uncle is my mom's older brother, Mark, who has basically decided that I'm the official disappointment of the family because I dropped out of college, bounced between jobs, and don't have kids or a mortgage at 31. He works in sales for some regional supplier, always talking like he's on the verge of closing a huge deal, and he loves throwing out little jabs in front of people. He's the guy who claps you on the back just a bit too hard and laughs a bit too loud, like he's performing for an audience. The last time we were together, at Easter, he made some comment about DoorDash University because I picked up delivery shifts on the side for extra cash. I laughed it off then because my grandma was there and I didn't want to cause a scene. But I remember going home afterward, sitting in my parked car, staring at my steering wheel, just feeling small and stupid for letting it slide again. So, yeah, going into this birthday, I already had that tight feeling in my chest, the "let's just get through this" mentality. I showered, threw on a plain gray hoodie and jeans, and grabbed a folder from my desk drawer before heading out. The folder is important. It's been sitting there for months, ever since my dad handed me a stack of papers and said, quietly, "Just hold on to this in case we ever need it." They were printouts of court records and a couple of old emails my dad had saved, showing that Uncle Mark had been sued by a credit card company, had a car repossessed a few years back, and had borrowed money from my grandparents without paying any of it back. My dad had co-signed one of those loans, which is how he ended up with the documents. I remember reading through them the first time, my stomach turning, realizing how much of Mark's successful provider persona was basically held together with duct tape and bravado. I slipped the folder into my backpack, not because I planned some big dramatic reveal, but because I was tired of feeling defenseless. It felt like carrying a fire extinguisher. You hope you don't need it, but you're glad it's there if something ignites. The drive over to my grandparents' house was the same route I've done since I was a kid, past the same sad little strip of stores, the same gas station with the flickering sign, the same stretch of road that always smells a little like exhaust and stale fries from the fast food place on the corner. The sky was that flat, gray Ohio kind that makes everything look washed out. I had the radio on low, some sports talk show mumbling about trades, but my mind was just replaying old comments from my uncle like a highlight reel of petty humiliation. When I pulled up to my grandparents' place, there were already cars lined up along the curb. Their house is a small, single-story place with tan siding and a tiny front porch my grandpa still sweeps off even though he walks with a bit of a shuffle now. I could smell charcoal already from the backyard grill, mixing with that slightly damp smell from the grass because it had rained the night before. Inside, I could hear that familiar overlapping noise of family, my aunt's laugh, my cousin's kids running around, the clink of plates, and the hum of a TV from the living room. I took a second in the car to breathe, grabbed my backpack like a shield, and headed in. My mom met me in the hallway with that stressed, overly bright smile she does when she's trying to keep the peace. She hugged me, and I could smell her perfume, something light and floral she's worn for years. "You're on time," she said, like that was a surprise. In the kitchen, my grandma was fussing over potato salad and deviled eggs, the counters already crowded with bags of burger buns, jars of pickles, and a cake box from the grocery store. Grandpa was in his recliner in the living room, wearing a polo shirt tucked into slacks, the TV on some daytime show he wasn't really watching. My cousins were half on their phones, half entertaining their kids. It all felt normal, which in a weird way made the knot in my stomach even tighter, because I knew that normal only lasted until my uncle decided to open his mouth. He showed up about 20 minutes after me, making an entrance like always. The front door opened, and I heard him before I saw him, talking loud about traffic and idiots who can't merge, like he'd been personally victimized by every other driver on the highway. He walked in wearing a crisp button-down shirt, a smartwatch, and sunglasses pushed up on his head, even though we were inside. He smelled faintly like cologne and cigarette smoke, which always threw me off because he pretends he doesn't smoke. He gave my mom a big hug, clapped my dad on the shoulder, and then turned to me with that mocking half-smile like we were in on some joke together. "Hey, there he is," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Our resident free spirit. You working these days, or just finding yourself still?" A couple of people chuckled politely, the kind of awkward laugh you do when you're not sure if something is actually funny or just mean. My face felt hot immediately. I mumbled something about my job, IT support for a small company, plus side gigs, and tried to move past him toward the backyard. He didn't stop, though. He never does. "I'm just messing with you," he added, patting my shoulder, but his tone had that edge to it. "Someone's got to be the family disappointment, right?" He said it like it was just harmless teasing, but the words hung there in the hallway heavy and sour. I felt my jaw clench, that familiar buzzing in my ears starting up. My mom shot me a quick look, like, "Please don't start anything." My grandma suddenly found something urgent to check in the oven, even though we weren't baking anything. My dad pretended to be absorbed in his phone. It was one of those micro moments where everyone pretends they didn't hear the cruelty in the comment, because calling it out would mean admitting that it was cruel. I just walked past him, backpack slung over my shoulder, and stepped out onto the small concrete patio where the grill was smoking and the air was cooler. I focused on the smell of the charcoal and the sound of kids shrieking over some game with a soccer ball, trying to push the word disappointment out of my head. The rest of the late morning went about how you'd expect. Burgers and hot dogs on the grill, everyone hovering around the folding table covered in a plastic tablecloth with balloons on it, paper plates bending under piles of food. The sun tried to push through the clouds a few times, making it just warm enough that the potato salad started to sweat in its bowl. I sat at one of the plastic chairs near the edge of the yard, eating quietly, listening to my cousins talk about their kids' sports schedules and school fundraisers. Uncle Mark floated from group to group like he always does, drink in hand, throwing out comments and stories about his clients and bonuses, laughing just a little too hard at his own jokes. Every now and then, I'd catch him glancing over at me with that smug look, and I could feel the folder in my backpack resting against the back of my chair, like a secret. At one point, my grandpa called everyone into the dining room to do cake and sing happy birthday. It's the same routine every year. Lights a little dimmer inside, the smell of frosting and coffee mixing as people squeeze around the table. My grandma put the cake in front of him, this white sheet cake with blue icing that said "Happy Birthday, Dad," in that slightly crooked supermarket frosting handwriting. We sang. My grandpa smiled that small, slightly embarrassed smile he always does, and for a few seconds, it felt genuinely sweet. Then we cut cake, passed plates, and people drifted into clusters along the walls and in the living room, balancing flimsy paper plates on their laps. I stayed near the dining table, mostly because it felt like neutral territory. That's when the conversation shifted. It started with something small, my cousin talking about buying a new car, her husband mentioning interest rates, my dad making a comment about how things were cheaper back then. Money talk. It always finds its way in. Uncle Mark was leaning against the doorway, fork in his cake, talking about leveraging credit and how you have to spend money to make money, like he was on some motivational podcast. Someone, maybe my aunt, asked me how my job was going, and I answered honestly. It's fine, not glamorous, but steady, and I picked up some extra part-time work doing remote help desk stuff in the evenings. It wasn't said in a complaining way, just matter of fact. But Mark seized on it like he'd been waiting. He took a bite of cake, chewed, and then, with that same half-smirk, said, "Man, I remember being your age and already having a house, a new car, and 2 kids. Different mindset, I guess. But hey, not everyone's cut out to be a provider. Some people are just more comfortable staying at the bottom." He actually flicked his fork slightly in my direction when he said "bottom," like he was pointing to the problem in the room. The conversation around us dipped just enough that it was obvious people heard him, but no one rushed to jump in. My stomach dropped. I could feel my face go hot again, my heart speeding up, the fork in my hand suddenly heavy and awkward. I heard one of my younger cousins whisper, "Ouch," under her breath. I laughed, but it came out thin and shaky. My instinct was the same as always: shrug it off, make a self-deprecating joke, change the subject. That's the script I've been following for years. Except this time, I glanced over at my dad. He was staring down at his cake, his thumb pressing into the edge of the paper plate so hard it bent. My mom's eyes were closed for a second like she had a headache. My grandpa, sitting at the head of the table, had stopped chewing and was just looking at his plate. It hit me in that moment that it wasn't just me he was disrespecting. He was insulting the people who quietly helped him, covered for him, and carried his dead weight, while he strutted around the family pretending to be this big success. Something inside me shifted from embarrassed to tired. Not angry in the yelling way, just worn out. I took a sip of my coffee, lukewarm now, a little bitter, and realized my hand wasn't shaking as much as I expected. I set the cup down carefully, wiped my fingers on a napkin, and felt the chair creak as I leaned back. I could feel the strap of my backpack against my ankle where it was resting under the table. For the first time ever in one of these moments, instead of wanting to disappear, I had this clear, solid thought. I don't actually have to sit here and let him define me in front of everyone. I don't have to keep eating this version of me he keeps serving up. As the silence hung there, it was like the room split in two. People who wanted to look away and pretend it hadn't been said, and people waiting to see what I would do. My grandpa finally cleared his throat and reached for his coffee, his hand a little unsteady. My grandma fussed with serving more cake even though everyone already had some. My mom opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. Mark just kept eating his cake, that smirk still there, like he'd scored a point and was waiting for the laugh track to kick in. I pushed my chair back slightly, enough to make a small scraping sound on the floor. It wasn't dramatic, but a few heads turned. My heart was pounding, but my mind felt weirdly calm. I reached down, grabbed my backpack, and pulled it up onto my lap, feeling the stiff edges of the folder inside. I unzipped the backpack slowly, more to buy myself a second than anything, and I could feel everyone's attention flicker between me and their plates, like nobody wanted to be caught staring, but nobody wanted to miss whatever was about to happen either. I slid the folder out and set it on the table next to my paper plate, just a regular manila folder with a little crease on one corner from where it had been shoved into a drawer for too long. My uncle glanced at it, then at me, with this confused little wrinkle between his eyebrows. "What's that, your resume?" he said, still trying to keep it in joke territory, but his voice had a tightness now that wasn't there a minute ago. I didn't answer right away. I just rested my hand on top of the folder and took another breath. The room felt warmer, like the air had thickened. I could hear the hum of the fridge from the kitchen and the faint laughter of kids still playing in the backyard, muffled by the sliding glass door. I wasn't planning some big speech. I'm not that guy. What came out of my mouth was simple and quiet, which somehow made it land even harder in the silence. I said something like, "I'm tired of being the only one you point at when you talk about screw-ups." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I wasn't yelling, just talking like I would if I was telling a story to a friend at a bar. I tapped the folder with my fingers and added, "Especially when I'm not the only one in this family who's had some issues." I glanced at my dad as I said it, and he looked up at me with this mix of worry and resignation, like he already knew what road I was about to walk down and couldn't stop me. My mom whispered my name under her breath, a warning, but she didn't reach out to physically stop me. That was new. My uncle straightened up against the doorway, putting his fork down on his plate with a soft clink. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, and now his tone wasn't playful at all. The room seemed to contract around us. One of my cousins shifted on the couch, and I saw my grandma's hand freeze halfway to a coffee pot. Grandpa kept his eyes on me, though, which somehow made me feel less like a kid and more like someone who had a right to speak. I opened the folder, and the faint smell of paper and printer ink floated up, weirdly sharp in my nose. The top page was one of the court documents with his name in bold print at the top, the kind of official-looking thing you never want to see your name on. I slid it halfway out so his name and the case number were visible. I didn't wave it around or anything. I just turned it so it faced him, resting on the table. "You're not the only one who knows how to read numbers," I said quietly. It wasn't clever or rehearsed. It was literally the first thing that formed in my head, and I let it out before I could overthink it. The effect was immediate. Uncle Mark's face went from smug to blank, and then his eyes dropped to the paper. You could actually see the recognition hit. His skin got a little pale around his mouth. He took one step closer, then another, the floor creaking under his weight. "Where did you get that?" he asked, but it came out low and tight, not loud. No more audience voice. No more performance. Just a guy who suddenly realized the stage had shifted under him. Nobody else in the room said anything, but I could hear the small sounds of people adjusting in their chairs, the shifting of fabric, the scrape of someone nudging their plate a little farther away like they needed their hands free. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my neck, but my thoughts were weirdly clear. I kept my eyes on him and said, "You remember when you asked my grandparents for help with that investment that went bad? When you needed Dad to co-sign because your credit was shot?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my grandpa flinch slightly, his jaw tightening. My grandma's hand finally found the coffee pot, but she didn't pour. She just held it like she needed something to grip. My mom looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Mark's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but it lacked the conviction he usually had. He stepped right up to the table now, close enough that I could smell his cologne under the sugar and coffee. He reached for the paper like he was going to grab it, but I put my hand flat on it, pinning it down. Our eyes met, and for once, he was the one looking away first. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, still not raising my voice. "You call me a disappointment every chance you get like it's a joke everyone's supposed to laugh at, but you're the one who couldn't pay your bills. You're the one who needed them." I nodded toward my grandparents, "to bail you out. And you've never once admitted that in front of anybody." You could have heard a pin drop. Even the TV in the living room, which had been murmuring in the background all afternoon, suddenly felt too loud, so my dad reached for the remote and muted it without saying a word. My uncle looked around the room like he was expecting someone to jump in and defend him, to roll their eyes and tell me I was out of line. Nobody did. My grandpa's eyes were wet, but his expression was hard. My grandma had finally set the coffee pot down and was twisting a napkin between her fingers. My cousins were all staring, some with their mouths slightly open, like they were seeing their dad or uncle in a completely new light. One of the kids wandered in from the backyard, took one look at the grown-ups and the tight air in the room, and backed out again without a word. Mark tried to recover, tried to throw the spotlight back onto me like he always did. "Oh, so this is about you being sensitive?" he said, his voice rising a notch. "You dig up old crap because you can't handle a joke? That's pathetic, Ryan." He laughed once, but it came out harsh and empty. "Everyone here knows I've worked my ass off for this family. I helped your mom. I helped your dad. He stopped himself, maybe realizing that listing favors would backfire, given the documentation sitting under my hand. I watched his throat work as he swallowed. A bead of sweat had formed at his temple, and he wiped it away quickly, like he hoped nobody noticed. They did. My dad finally spoke up, not in some big heroic defense of me, but in this tired, matter-of-fact way that somehow cut deeper than yelling. He said, "Mark, you know exactly what that is. You know how many nights Mom called us crying because the collectors were calling the house. You know how many times Dad pulled from his retirement to cover your short-term problem?" His voice shook a little at the end, not from anger, but from that kind of old frustration that's been sitting inside for years, waiting to spill. Hearing my dad talk like that, in front of everyone, shifted something in the room. This wasn't just me airing dirty laundry. This was a pattern that everyone older had quietly been dealing with while we younger ones caught the fallout in the form of comments and tension. My uncle's face twisted, and he pointed at me, like he needed a target to regain control. "So now what? You want to meddle because you didn't get into debt?" he snapped. "You still live in an apartment and drive that piece of junk car. You're not exactly the picture of success, kid." The word kid stung, even though I'm 31. It always does when it comes from him. But this time, instead of shrinking, I just nodded slowly. "Yeah," I said. "I drive a beat-up car I paid for myself. I rent because I don't want to overextend. I work a job that doesn't impress you, but my bills are paid. I'm not asking anyone here to bail me out. So if I'm a disappointment in your eyes, I honestly don't care as much as I used to." And that was the truth. Saying it out loud made me realize how done I was with trying to live up to whatever fake scoreboard he was using. It wasn't some triumphant movie moment. It felt awkward and raw and kind of shaky. My voice cracked a little at the end, and I had to clear my throat. But I meant every word. I slid a couple more pages out of the folder, an old email chain about late payments, another court notice, just enough for anyone close by to see that there was more than one incident. I didn't shove it in anyone's face. I just let it sit there like a quiet pile of reality. The smell of icing and coffee had turned my stomach a bit now. I pushed my half-eaten cake away, the paper plate leaving a faint streak of frosting on the tablecloth. My grandpa finally said, very softly, "I told you no more, Mark." That was all. Short, tired, and final in a way I hadn't heard from him before. That's when things started to really wobble. My aunt, Mark's wife, went pale. She stared at the documents, then at him, like she was doing math in her head and didn't like the total. One of my cousins muttered, "What the hell?" under her breath, then caught herself because the younger kids had wandered back in again and were hovering by the doorway, sensing something was off. My mom stood up and started gathering plates like she could clean her way out of the situation, but her hands were shaking so much that one of the forks clattered to the floor. She didn't pick it up right away. The normal family rhythm, cake, coffee, small talk, was completely gone. In its place was this heavy, waiting silence, like everyone expected some kind of explosion. Instead of that, the tension came out sideways. Mark snapped at his wife for looking at him like that, then immediately turned it on my dad again, accusing him of poisoning the kid against him. My dad just shook his head, rubbed his forehead, and didn't respond, which seemed to make Mark even angrier. He pointed at the folder again and said, "You had no right to bring that here." I shrugged. "You had no right to keep taking shots at me every time we're in the same room," I replied. But here we are. My cousin's husband, who usually stays on the edges of family drama, shifted his weight and murmured that maybe this wasn't the time or place, but nobody really backed him up. For once, nobody rushed to smooth it over and pretend everything was fine. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, but underneath the adrenaline there was this strange, growing sense of relief. Not because I'd won anything yet, but because the script had finally changed. I wasn't the silent target anymore. I had put something concrete on the table, literally, that everyone could see. No more vague sense that I was overreacting to just jokes. No more private knowledge of stuff my uncle had done while he paraded around like he was the only responsible adult in the family. The truth was sitting there in black and white. What people chose to do with it was out of my hands. I leaned back in my chair, my hand finally leaving the folder, and let the room react however it was going to react. My uncle looked like he wanted to grab everything off the table and rip it into pieces, but the problem was that too many eyes were on him now, and not the admiring. Mark's telling another story, eyes he was used to. These were flat, uncomfortable, assessing eyes. The kind that say, very plainly, "We're finally seeing what we weren't supposed to see." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a little by the dining room doorway, muttering something about old paperwork and taken out of context, but nobody jumped in to rescue him. Even his wife had stepped slightly back, like she needed more physical distance to think clearly. My grandpa's hands were folded in front of him, steady now, but his face was the definition of disappointment, not the way my uncle had weaponized the word, but the genuine kind, like a slow heartbreak. The weirdest part was how ordinary the room looked while everything shifted. The cake knife still sat on its little plastic tray. A paper cup had tipped sideways near the napkin holder, dripping a thin line of punch onto the table. The smell of frosting and barbecue smoke clung to the air. People stood or sat in these stiff poses, trying to make sense of what was happening while pretending they weren't looking directly at him. My younger cousin's kid wandered in again and asked if we were still doing cake, and his mom gently guided him back out without answering. The TV sat muted in the corner, a frozen image of a commercial still on the screen. All of that normalcy made the tension feel heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. I finally pushed my chair back and stood up, mostly because sitting felt too vulnerable at that point. My knees popped a little, and that tiny sound felt embarrassingly loud in the space. Uncle Mark stopped pacing and glared at me like I'd personally put him on trial. "So what?" he said, his voice sharp and cracking at the edges. "You think you're some kind of hero now? You think bringing this up makes you better than me?" I shook my head. I wasn't smiling or triumphant. I was just exhausted. "No," I said. "I think it makes me done." And I meant it. My voice wasn't shaky anymore. It just felt heavy and honest, like a weight I hadn't been able to set down until that moment finally slid off my shoulders. My mom murmured my name again, this time more pleading than warning, but she didn't tell me to apologize or sit down. She just looked sad, like she was realizing how many years this dynamic had been playing out right under her nose. My dad stared at the table, tapping his thumb lightly against his coffee cup. Grandpa nodded once, the smallest, subtlest nod, but it was enough to make my chest feel tight for a second. My uncle opened his mouth like he was going to fire back with something nasty, then closed it. His jaw worked. His breathing was uneven. The man who always had a comeback suddenly didn't have one. I reached for the folder again, not to wave it around, but to slide the papers back inside. The documents made that crisp sound as they shifted against each other, a sound I'd heard a dozen times while looking them over alone in my apartment, but which somehow sounded louder here, in front of everyone. I placed the folder back into my backpack and zipped it up. The zipper caught a little near the end, and I had to tug it. Another small, awkward sound in a room full of them. My uncle watched every movement, eyes darting between my hands and the bag like he expected me to pull out more evidence. I didn't. I'd said what I needed to say. The rest wasn't my burden anymore. When I slung the backpack over my shoulder, the strap brushed against the side of my chair and made it wobble slightly. People shifted, like they weren't sure if I was leaving or preparing to say more. I didn't have anything else to say, though. I just stood there for a second, letting the room settle. My mouth felt dry, probably from the coffee and nerves, so I grabbed my cup and finished the last sip, even though it was cold and bitter by then. My grandma finally whispered, "Ryan," in this trembling voice, but I gave her a soft smile and shook my head gently, like telling her I wasn't angry at her, or at my grandparents, or even at the rest of the family. Just done with the part I'd been forced to play. My uncle finally snapped. "You don't get to walk out like you're the victim," he said, stepping closer again. His voice was louder now, rising up fast, like he was trying to reclaim control by sheer volume. "You showed up here to embarrass me in front of everyone. You planned this. You think that makes you better? You're just proving my point. No respect, no maturity, nothing." A bit of spit caught on the corner of his mouth as he talked, and he wiped it angrily with the back of his hand. But his eyes told the truth. He was panicked, cornered, and scrambling. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking beneath it. Before he could continue, Grandpa spoke again. "That's enough, Mark." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm in a way that hit like a hammer. Everyone stopped. Even the kids hovering in the hallway froze. Grandpa rarely raises his voice, and he hadn't here either, but the authority in it shut the whole room down. My uncle stared at him, waiting for the protection he usually got, but Grandpa just held his gaze with this weary disappointment that seemed to hollow him out. "You've said enough to him over the years," Grandpa added. "He's done nothing to deserve the way you've talked to him." The room seemed to tilt. My uncle's face broke for a second. Something wounded flashed across it before he clamped down on it again. "So you're taking his side now?" he barked, but it sounded more like a plea than an accusation. My grandma wiped under her eyes with a napkin, her hands trembling. My mom rubbed her forehead. My dad finally leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath like he'd been holding it for years. My cousins avoided Mark's eyes entirely. The illusion that he was the stable one, the successful one, the opinion that mattered. That illusion just kind of dissolved right there in the stale air of the dining room. I felt the urge to apologize for causing a scene, a reflex I'd had all my life. But I swallowed it down. I hadn't caused anything. I'd just stopped being the quiet landing spot for his cruelty. I adjusted my backpack strap again and stepped toward the doorway. My heart was still beating fast, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was adrenaline mixed with clarity. My uncle stepped toward me like he might block my path, but my dad stood up, just slightly, enough for Mark to hesitate. Dad didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The tiny shift in his posture was enough to make my uncle step back half a foot. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing the edge of the wall as I moved into the hallway. The carpet felt soft under my shoes, and I became aware of how warm my face still was. I could smell the faint scent of the air freshener Grandma always uses in the hallway, something floral and a little powdery. My mom followed me a few steps and touched my arm lightly. "You don't have to go," she whispered. I nodded. "I know," I said, "but I want to." And that was true. For the first time in a long time, leaving didn't feel like running away. It felt like choosing myself over a cycle I wasn't going to participate in anymore. As I reached the front door, I heard something behind me. Movement, A muffled argument starting to swell between Mark and my aunt, my grandpa's voice trying to quiet things down. I didn't turn around. The air outside felt colder than I expected, biting my skin through the hoodie, but it was clean and open and didn't have that heavy feeling the dining room had. My car was parked under the streetlight, and the sky had shifted into that late afternoon dimness where everything looks slightly bluish. I could smell someone grilling a few houses down, the smoke drifting lightly in the breeze. It felt grounding somehow. I got into my car, shut the door, and sat there for a second with my hands on the steering wheel. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked tired, but lighter. When I started the engine, the radio came back on softly, the same sports show from earlier. I didn't feel like listening anymore, so I turned it off and just let the quiet fill the space. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw my cousin, one of the older ones, step outside onto the porch, her arms crossed against the cold. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring back into the house with this look like she was finally putting pieces together. She gave a small nod when our eyes briefly met. Not approval, exactly, just recognition. I drove away slowly, the tires crunching lightly against the damp pavement. The streetlights blinked on behind me as I turned the corner. My hands were steadier on the wheel than they'd been in months. I didn't know what the fallout inside that house would be, and honestly, it wasn't my job to manage it anymore. For years, I'd been the easy target, the one who let the comments slide because confronting him felt too big, too messy. But walking away now, after finally saying something, felt like reclaiming something I lost a long time ago without noticing. I wasn't a disappointment. I wasn't the family screw-up. I was just a guy trying to live his life without being dragged down by someone else's insecurity. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the sky had gone nearly dark. The walkway lights buzzed faintly. When I stepped out of the car, the cold air hit my face again, waking me up even more. I could still feel the leftover adrenaline in my arms, but it wasn't shaking anymore, just humming under the surface. I climbed the stairs to my unit, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The familiar smell of my place, laundry detergent, coffee grounds, the faint plastic smell of my shower curtain, wrapped around me like a blanket. I set the backpack on the counter and pulled out the folder one more time. I didn't open it. I just held it for a second, then slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk. I didn't need it anymore.